request now Joydeep to start his presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, we all know Vishwa and Joydeep, so I will, in order to save time, I will not do the introduction. Joydeep, stage is all yours.
Thank you, Hari. Welcome, everyone. And I want to thank all the panelists for their presentations, which I heard with great interest. And it seems that there's a sort of convergence of research interests and concerns here, which I think should be reflected in the discussion. I was hoping that Professor Adluri would join us. He was supposed to, and I'm still hopeful that he will, at least for the latter half of the presentation, so he can participate in, or rather answer your questions directly. Since we're running short of time, I will not wait to see if he does join us, but let me open my presentation and then start sharing it right away. So I will try to keep this going quite smoothly and swiftly because time is of the essence. If there are questions, please feel free to stop me or come back at the end or put them in chat as you prefer. This was the original title of the presentation, and at the background of this was a kind of thinking that Vishwa and I have been engaged in on thinking of the professoriate itself as an object of sociological analysis and seeing what kind of class it is, what are its class interests, how has the professoriate developed. So I just have two books here I want to hold up that I'm planning to teach a course based on these two, which is probably not easy to see when I was sharing. So this is one on the rise of the research university, and this is on the professoriate as a Mandarin class. Both books I greatly recommend. So the encounter between Hinduism or India and the West has to be seen not only in terms of the peculiar features of Hinduism, but in terms of the peculiar features of the class that for the most part was responsible for the reception of this culture, its reception, its translation, and its transmission to wider European audiences. So what Vishwa and I have focused in all our books on is the peculiar role of Indology or Indologists as purveyors of the exotic to European audiences for about 2 centuries, and the way the particular interests, religious, political, social, class interests of this group sort of inserted themselves into the dialogue between two cultures and in very significant ways distorted both cultures in the eyes of the other. Okay, so that to set up the presentation. So the woke Buddhas of academia is, of course, the Buddhas are the enlightened professoriate, and it's a play on the word enlightenment, which, as we will see, has two very different senses in Buddhism and in the European Enlightenment. Okay, so the presentation is divided into 4 parts. Every time there's a section break, you will see this bright yellow screen, so it'll be very clear moving on to the next section. I want to begin with a small anecdote which is told by Don Lopez in his book on Buddhism. He says when he was teaching at the University of Michigan in 1994, the Dalai Lama made a visit. And as part of this visit, he had 3 graduate students present on the origins of the Mahayana to the Dalai Lama. And they made 2 or 3 claims. The most important ones are listed here. First is that the Mahayana did not begin as a single and self-conscious movement, but instead was a disparate collection of cults of the book centered on new sutras composed around the beginning of the Common Era. Indeed, the first epigraphic use of the term Mahayana occurs only in the 5th century CE, some 500 years after the composition of the first Mahayana sutras. So you see, they are presenting back to the Dalai Lama the history of Buddhism and showing that it is not the simple linear story that it is taken to be, but that there is a sort of composite origin, and these names are retrospectively applied. The Dalai Lama listened very patiently. So this is just Don Lopez's retelling of the story. He listened patiently with a smile on his face. And then he said that a friend, a great Lama of his, had seen each of the past masters of the lineage from previous centuries appear in the air along the ceiling of the temple when he was deep in meditation. What the students had told him was interesting, and it would be good for Buddhists to have some knowledge of Western scholarship on Buddhism, But in the end, Buddhist practice and Buddhist scholarship, at least of the Western variety, are ultimately irreconcilable. These are not my statements. This is Don Lopez's summary of what the Dalai Lama said. And 3 points here are important. If he accepted what they had told him, he would only be able to believe in the Rupa Kaya, the physical body of the Buddha that appears in the world to teach the Dharma. He could not believe in the Sambhoga Kaya, the body of enjoyment that appears to advance bodhisattvas, blah, blah, blah. And he could not believe in the Dharmakaya, the Buddha's omniscient mind and its nature of emptiness. And the final is a direct quote that Lopez relates. If I believed what you told me, the Buddha would only be a nice person. So this anecdote that Lopez recounts to show how, say, a traditional approach to Buddhism would look at it and how Western scholarship has framed the approach to Buddhism is an interesting story to begin with, because it shows the enormous epistemic differences that separate the two. It's not so easy to speak of Western Buddhism unless we acknowledge that these are very, very broad and irreconcilable frameworks that are sort of meeting up against each other. I want to now share not my own presentation, but something else, because this view that we may have two irreconcilable systems of thought meeting up against each other is not just mine. It's actually something that the Dalai Lama himself, in an interview with, I think it was PBS or NPR, expressed. It is PBS, so I always slow down when I have to share screens. Here we go. Okay, this is an interview with PBS. I will put the link in chat if anyone is interested in reading the whole thing. But I want to read this section onwards. Are you looking for converts in the West and America? This is the question asked. And the Dalai Lama says, no, never. That's a mistake. I have firm belief the people like Westerners, like Americans, you have Judeo-Christian traditions. So generally your people should keep your own traditions, should not change your faith. Severson, is it possible for me to be a good Christian and still be a good Buddhist? Dalai Lama. Now, already I found some of my Christian brothers, sisters, you see very good Christian, very faithful to the concept of creator, but at the same time taking some Buddhist methods or Buddhist technique, either to increase the spiritual forgiveness or the tolerance and compassion. Then comes the next question. Even though casual Buddhism can complement Christianity, His Holiness says at the core there is a fundamental difference. I think His Holiness here is reference to the Pope probably. Dalai Lama, if you reach some higher spiritual experience, spiritual state, then I think it is difficult. The Buddhist concept, everything comes and happens due to law of causality, cause and effect, cause and effect, cause and effect. This indicates there's no central absolute cause or creator. So since Buddhism do not have a concept of creator, some scholars say Buddhism is not a religion, but science of mind. So Buddhism also kind of atheism. You see, you unify or mix both, then difficult. Sooner or later, clash. That's as much as we need of this interview. In other interviews that I've read with the Dalai Lama, he has repeatedly expressed this. When he was younger and he met Western people interested in Buddhism, he was very open and welcoming and thought they could be Buddhists like anyone born into Buddhism. Later on, he realized that this leads to a lot of problems, a lot of confusion, and he started advocating a position that it's better to stay in the faith you were raised in. And you can, of course, incorporate some aspects of Buddhism, but he felt that in the interest of the people seeking a new spirituality, they should A, remain grounded in their own tradition, and B, not attempt to sort of fuse the two other than borrowing some elements. Let me now return to where we were. So this is just from the Huntington archive. If you wanted to have a visual representation of the three bodies, the two images I have to show you the three bodies. But the point that interests us is the notion of the historical appearance of the individual within a historical timeline, a space that we call history or world history. And this is what in Western thinking is sort of considered absolutely secure, the basic fact we must set out from, and everything else must be seen as a transformation of this historical anthropocentric reality. That notion of history actually comes from a notion of biblical history. So this is a graphic description of that. And we would perhaps be appearing somewhere between, sorry, not between the return of Christ, somewhere, between the return of Christ and the second coming. So somewhere there in that timeline, we are supposed to find ourselves. And the idea that this is objectively true, that there is a process called history into which individual narratives, individual histories of different people feed in, and they all have to be gathered up, and collectively a story has to be fashioned called world history. This is a sort of precept with strong theological underpinnings. The historical approach to Indian texts is a tributary or emerges from this theological notion of history, and the attempt to analyze Indian texts, place them into a secure timeline of this kind, emerges from that interest. The second aspect of the Lopez Dalai Lama anecdote, or the vignette that I told you that interests us, is obviously there is now a normative claim being made that the Dalai Lama, of course, has his traditional approach, which is metaphysical, which believes in transcendent bodies beyond the physical manifestation, the Rupakaya. And of course, we now have a critical objective story or history of Buddhism, which is able to show that the claims made from Mahayana, for instance, are not true, not historically valid. This is an old debate. So to cite relevant aspects of this debate, I should go into full screen view for you. This debate is not new. It's been made time and again. Here you have Jürgen Haneda, who's an Indologist in Marburg. Incidentally, when Marburg's chair was about to be closed, they invited the Dalai Lama to sort of show up and give a talk and lecture, and using him as a kind of proxy, they got that chair renewed. So you see, it's a kind of very complex, tenuous relationship where on the one hand, they want to be overseers over the tradition, critical of the tradition. On the other hand, they know that if the tradition didn't exist, there would be nothing for them to do. They have and will always be parasitic on indigenous intellectual traditions or long-standing intellectual traditions. And then they will use a guest lecture from the Dalai Lama, inviting an Orientalist from Bhandarkar Oriental Institute and so on. They will use that to sustain authority, funding, etc., and their chairs at university. So let me read this very quickly. The Pandit's proficiency in a subject is often coupled with a certain way of life, and it may be difficult to divorce the academic aspect from the Pandit identity. Since he is supposed not only to function as a mere scholar, his view of the culture he embodies through his erudition is necessarily more holistic. At this point, if you take out the word Pandit, Jürgen Haneda could be lecturing to the Dalai Lama. Western Indology, with its specifically historically oriented critical approach, so this is what the students were embodying, this is what they were teaching back to the Dalai Lama, had to make use of the Indian Panditya in order to get as much as possible first-hand information, but it could not accept its theological dimension without compromising its aims as a historical subject. So this would be the implicit conclusion of that encounter, is to say, we can't accept the theological dimensions of what you're saying about Mahayana Buddhism. We cannot accept these transcendent bodies you're talking about. We are a historical subject, and all we know is that this tradition emerged piecemeal at these dates in this order. Since the source of misunderstanding persists until to date, it should be made clear that the Western approach is not to belittle traditional Indian learning, but a methodological necessity. All right. We have a second slide here, similar comments being made, contrasting the analytic thinking of Western interpreters who were schooled in historical philological methods. It stands in contrast to the traditional Indian commentators who not only harmonized and freely downplayed all breaks in the text, but above all sought to read their own philosophical theological concepts out of individual textual passages. I won't read the rest, it's up on the screen if you wish to read. This is Heinrich von Stetten-Kron. His name is misspelled, I just noticed. And on the left, you see an image of the gentleman himself, and he's being awarded the Distinguished Indologist Award by the President of India. So again, that comment I made about a reciprocal relationship where they are on the one hand critical of and wish to maintain oversight over the Indian tradition. On the other side, they do depend on Indians to confer legitimacy on them, to provide audiences for them. That remains here. But for our purposes, the only interesting thing to note is that the implicit claim is that the Western scholar is more objective, He is not interested in claiming divine authority or securing divine authority out of controlling the text. He's not there with an agenda trying to read his own philosophical, theological concepts out of the text. This is false. This is the point that needs to be contested. The Western Indologist is as much a product of a social environment, as much embedded in a social context and pursuing fairly sort of mediocre, mundane interests, mercenary interests in authority, in power, as any other kind of intellectual tradition, and therefore needs to be critiqued from that perspective. So a very dramatic claim was made that Indian scholars are not critical, but Western scholars have a proper philological methodology, which is objective and not subject to these kinds of personal social influences. Let's examine the evidence. So on the right, you see a table. This was published in a Brill volume on the history of Hinduism in Europe. So I've extracted it from there. The article is also available on our academia webpage. And you see a history of Gita interpretation where a great game was created called The Search for the Original Gita. And out of the 700 verses of the transmitted text, each scholar then made up an completely arbitrary criterion saying, for example, Holtzman saying only the pantheistic elements are original, and then he removes everything that he doesn't think matches his definition and says the original Gita was these 164 verses, and so on and so forth. The game continues. In the most extreme case, we can look at von Simpson towards the bottom. He removes 991 verses of the text because of very far-fetched logic. So these are massive interventions into the textual tradition, not really based on a secure methodology. So let's look on the left side now. Despite the claim of an objective scientific method, Western scholars failed to arrive at objective knowledge. Each scholar arrived at his own conclusions about the original Gita. There was no method either, so everyone proposed his own subjective, tendentious criteria for identifying layers. Notice now the authority or the power differential that is in play. Indian scholars are blamed for not recognizing breaks that only Western scholars had posited. This would be as though I go to a country and make up a story about its history or about a particular text, and then I demand recognition saying my approach is universal, secular, objective, when in fact it is reflective of my own religious, racial, nationalist concerns. So that's the fifth point. These breaks were the result of the peculiar reception history of the text in Germany. They were not related to anything else, and they were not objective features in the text. So where do these prejudices arise? To understand the prejudices the Gita was subject to, we have to go back to the history of Mahabharata reception. This is a slightly longer section, but I will do it very quickly. And we will see how the text was received in Germany and how those prejudices then became normative for the science of Indology. So let's evaluate the claims of scientificity. This is the start. This gentleman, Christian Lassen from Norway, although he settled in Germany and lived his entire life in Germany, except for a brief childhood in Norway, he proposed a racial interpretation of the Mahabharata based simply on two names, Pandu and Krishna, white and black. And he said these names clearly must refer to the two races that fought in ancient Indian history. And so the Mahabharata must be a historical account of a true battle, a real battle that was fought in ancient prehistory. The same interpretive scheme was also applied to the Ramayana. So by way of comparison, I have it up here. This is Albrecht Weber, who is a little younger than Christian Lassen. And he says that the Ramayana also must be based on a true historical battle. And that battle must be between the Aboriginals and the Aryans, because the Aryans have represented them as demons and giants and even as apes. And this is not meant to be a flattering comparison. So this is the historical interpretation or the historical truth. It's not even claiming to be an interpretation. It is the truth about Indian epics. The racial interpretation is also simultaneously the historical prejudice. Actually, no such racial battle exists, and Indologists have not been able to prove it. It is assumed that such a conflict must have been the basis. Although this conflict is hypothetical, indeed fictional, it is assumed to be the historical truth at the heart of the epic. Henceforth, any interpretation that does not invoke race will be considered mythological or religious, whereas the racial approach will appear scientific and historical. Let me pause there. I want to quickly send something. So I apologize for that interruption. I had to send Hari a message. Let me continue now. Let's continue now with the historical interpretation. What gives Lassen the authority to impose this set of categories on the text and not impose it tentatively, saying this is my approach, this is my interpretation, but just say this is what the text is really about, Lassen was interested in identifying an Indo-Germanic and a Semitic race. The ability to develop epic was the hallmark of the Indo-Germanic race. Now, obviously, when you have the Indians who are considered by him in his reading of Indian history, they are an Indo-Germanic people, they must also have an epic. The Mahabharata, however, does not match Lassen's ideas of what heroic epic is. And therefore, out of the existing Mahabharata, he had to distill something called a heroic epic, so that the claim could be made all Indo-Germanic peoples are characterized by their ability to develop epic. The Semite is characterized by his inability to develop epic. And the idea of an original Bharata underlying the Mahabharata gave him the ability to do this. So here is the quote I alluded to, where he says, he, the Semite as a type, is unsuccessful at creating epic because here the eye of the poet steps back before the object. The Indo-Germans alone have brought forth the great heroic poems that reflect the great deeds of antiquity, etc., etc. This passage continues quite extensively. If you want the whole citation, it is in the book Philology and Criticism. I'll put the link up in chat. But one of the things that he claims is that the Semite is egotistical. His God, Yahweh, is exclusive to him. Yahweh is not the God of all peoples, but of the Jews alone. And the implicit comparison with the exclusivism, the particularity of the Jews, is the universality of Christianity, which says that Christ is not just for Christians. Christ has, or rather this is Paul's interpretation, Christ has transcended the distinction between the Jews and the Gentiles. So how does Lassen go about fragmenting the Mahabharata? He has a three-stage interpretation. So I will only refer to the graphic on the right. There's a core. Remember, this was the racial battle of white Aryans and black aboriginals. And to this, in layers, people added things. So first, mythic historical narratives about kings. So still within the domain of the real, within the domain of history, but already mythologized. Then cosmology and stories about gods. Finally, didactic discourses, description of the earth and other worlds. So increasingly moving away from the real into the sphere of the fantastic. This difference, this development in Hinduism is correlated with the decline of the Aryan influence and the racial miscegenation that takes place as the Aryans advance into India. So whites, Aryans, Indo-Germans, call them what you will, they are able to see the real. They are able to recognize that history is the basic reality. All other peoples, particularly the blacks, the aboriginals, they are somehow, as an indication of their less developed intellectual capacity, they cannot recognize the real and flee into domains of myth and legend.
We have
also, by the way. All right, so we have now set up a very broad interpretive scheme to understand what is going on. Now we can look more specifically at the contrast between Buddhism and Brahmanism. I will not read these longer quotes. All they're saying is that the arrival of Buddhism in Europe, so there are two extensive books on which I've drawn. One is Bagchee, which is right here, which is an excellent book that I recommend. Anyone who's interested in the history of Indology beyond the science. And Myers, which is not as good a book. It's a bit dissertation-y, but he's gathered some material about the German reception of Buddhism. So that's a useful source. And both are basically saying that the reception of Buddhism occurred in the context of a certain Christian anxiety. There were two anxieties. One, in the Enlightenment, Christianity itself had come under attack. So although Europe was at the peak of its civilizational or military power, Christianity itself was on the defensive. And the second thing that was going on in Germany at this time is called the Kulturkampf, which Bismarck had launched, which was to drive out Catholic influence from German universities and make sure that the universities conform to a very strict sort of Protestant notions. This is the context in which Buddhism is received. And as Maya's book shows, Protestants and Catholics started fashioning Buddhism in different ways. We won't go into the details of that, but I want to take up Albrecht Weber, whom we already met, as the leading figure. And you see how closely this extremely intensely Protestant figure, he used to edit something called the Protestantische Zeitschrift, if I remember. He was the editor. He made appeals to the Prussian Minister of Education saying, support Indology, we will complete the work of Christianity, we will go to India and edit that text, and we will bring about a reformation, just as Martin Luther brought about a reformation here. We will do the same for Indians. I will give you all these quotes later in a handout. I'll put it up on academia. But this is important to note that Albrecht Weber was deeply Protestant, and he saw Indology's role as Protestantizing or reforming Hinduism. And here are 5 quotes from him. You can read them all. I'll summarize them quickly. In the first one, the Buddha is called, the awakened one is called, he says that he achieves a reformation upon a stupendous scale. In the second one, he says the greatest enemy of Brahmanism ever is Buddhism. Buddhism might actually have been able to suppress Brahmanism for a time, but like Catholicism and the Reformation, Brahmanism underwent purification and consequently also consolidation thanks to Buddhism. Finally, because of a dogged fanaticism arising out of self-interest, Brahmanism succeeded in reasserting itself and finally in driving Buddhism out from all of India. Next one, in its origins, Buddhism is one of the greatest, most radical reactions in favor of the universal human rights of the individual against the oppressive tyranny of so-called divine privileges based on birth and caste. Amidst the unrelenting distortion of all human feelings which the Brahmanic caste system and government entailed, appeared that man with his gospel of the equal rights of all men without difference of birth, class, caste or even gender. So I didn't put in gender there because I thought I'll cut the quote short. But today, as we heard from Conrad Els, this claim that Buddhism was sort of gender neutral or gender positive is completely false. So now I realize the significance of putting that word back, and I will put it back before I send you these quotes. Incidentally, these quotes are from several sources. I went through a couple of his articles and essays on Buddhism, so they're not all from one place, but I collected the most important ones of them. Next page, I will give you a summary. The Buddha was a reformer like Luther. So this is not just Albrecht Weber. I gave you the quotes as textual support, but these are very widespread views. The Buddha was a reformer like Luther. Buddhism started life as a reformation of Brahmanism. The Buddha brought a new gospel. So that word is explicitly used by Albrecht Weber in a couple of places, and other scholars use it too. It is called Evangelium. So that is gospel, the good news. What is this good news? He preaches equality and brotherhood of man in place of the caste system. Again, today we heard already in a presentation, this is a modern interpretation. He was not a social reformer. Weber even compares the Buddhist missionaries the Buddha dispatched in their devout religious zeal, their self-sacrifice, being not afraid of death, to Christian martyrs and missionaries. So a lot of projection onto Buddhism is going on here. His thesis that Buddhism with its anti-Brahmanical tendencies must have been flourishing in Magadha anticipates newer attempts by scholars to revive the trope of a rationalistic worldview, Buddhism, confronting the ritualistic worldview of Brahmanism, Bronkhorst. So we had 2 fantastic papers today on Bronkhorst's thesis showing the problems with it. And I want you to simply note that this is an old trope, this idea of Buddhism as enlightened, rational, scientific, progressive. All these things have been done before. They're coming out of 19th century scholarship. By way of apology for the 19th century Indologists, you can say, look, this was all new to them. They were unfamiliar with the materials coming out of India. Of course, they would use their own interpretive categories. Of course, they would apply their own experience of history to it. the interesting thing is that in the 20th century, when we live in a time of globalization, when we live in a time of cultural exchange, when Indian scholars are writing and correcting Western scholars, you have someone like Bronkhorst reviving these old anti-Brahmanic tendencies in scholarship on a very thin basis, as we heard from the paper just before. There is not much textual support. So something is going wrong in the academic approach to Hinduism at a very broad level when theses that are A, old, B, discarded and critiqued. In the next slide, I will show you that it's not a matter of opposing India to the West. Western Indologists themselves have critiqued these theories, yet they come back every so often, every 30 years, they are revived, either because of a lack of originality in the Western academy, or because it is easy to make up a provocative, though meaningless thesis and then get a lot of attention. So as I said, we have to look at the sociological factors in the background. These are the criticisms I mentioned. So Oldenburg, in his very large book on the Buddha, says people are accustomed to speak of Buddhism as opposed to Brahmanism somewhat in the way that it is allowable to speak of Lutheranism as an opponent of the papacy. Then he continues, but if they mean to picture to themselves a kind of Brahmanical church which is assailed by Buddha, which opposed its resistance to its operations like the resistance of the party in possession to an upstart, they are mistaken. Buddha did not find himself in the presence of a Brahmanical hierarchy, embracing the whole people, overshadowing the whole popular life. So way back in 1881, I think, is Oldenburg's book on Buddha. This parallel of a reformator has already been rejected. Now, remember that in the background, as I showed you when I cited Myers and McKechnie, in the background was a kind of peculiar anxiety. On the one hand, people like Albrecht Weber wanted to force the Catholicism-Protestant comparison onto Hinduism and say Hinduism is like Catholicism, Buddhism is like its Reformation, or at least an enlightened religion. On the other hand, there was also enormous anxiety because Buddhism was arriving in ever larger textual numbers to Western shores, and people were actually adopting Buddhism. You saw what the Dalai Lama had to say about that, but this is an old phenomenon. Starting in the 19th century, people were mixing up ideas of Christianity and Buddhism. And so Oldenburg, at the same time that he says this Reformation approach is not correct, wants to separate the Buddha and the Christ. So he says, all these narratives are absolutely wanting in individuality. We seek in vain to gather something therefrom as to how Buddha penetrated and operated on the private personal life of the individual among his disciples. Whenever we open our Gospels, we find portrayed the most delicate and deepest traces of the work of Jesus, which, providing consoling from man to man, very different from the picture which the Buddhist church has preserved to us of its master's work, the living human. The personal hides itself behind the system, the formula, etc., etc. No one to seek out and to console the suffering and the sorrowing. You're probably thinking, who the hell translated this? Oldenburg was a very popular author. He was one of the German Indologists most frequently translated into English. Trust me, the translator has done a brilliant job. I mean, I have translated extensive sections of Oldenburg. On the next pages, you'll see some of my own translations. It is not easy to make that man even passingly intelligible. Okay, let's come to the Mahabharata. The Buddhist Brahmanic approach was massively imported into the Mahabharata. It continues even today in scholarship with people like James L. Fitzgerald, who's translating the Chicago edition of
Chicago. 5 more minutes, Joy.
5 more minutes? Okay.
Is that okay?
I will then go very fast now.
Yeah.
Towards my conclusion. So Holtzman has this thesis of an ur-epos, and this original epic is composed by the Indo-Germans, and finally it is compiled by a Buddhist poet into glorification of Ashoka. By the way, Duryodhana is supposed to be Ashoka, and Ashwatthama is supposed to be the Buddha. Go figure. Buddhism is associated with Indian rationality, so all the development of Indian science and culture and grammar is attributed to Buddhism. There are 5 features of Buddhism: national solidarity, patriotic feeling, national progress, growing prosperity, art and poetry, scientific development of grammar, vital artistic and scientific life, most vital scientific consciousness. So Buddhism is associated, it is made in the mold, or the Ashokan period is made in the mold of 19th century the Second Reich, I suppose, roughly at that time. And here you have a contrast of Buddhism compared with Brahmanism. So the only important things we'll focus on, the first two is, one is enlightened, the other is unenlightened, one is tolerant, the other is prone to fundamentalist violence. We will skip the rest, but I will put this up so all of you can read it in detail. We will not look at the complex textual surgery that is done to make Indian history parallel Western history, or rather German history, where Catholicism has to be removed as somehow an imposition on the German tradition.
Joy.
Yes?
Yeah, Vishwa also has joined, so he said 5 more minutes. So you can take 7 or 8 minutes.
Okay, wonderful. Let me
Vishwa.
then... I only have, so I went through very fast on the surgery done to the Mahabharata, because that is spelled out in great detail in the Ney Science. And those of you who are interested, if you've not already read the Ney Science, you can trace that history in detail. I want to come to the idea of racial contamination, because someone pointed out at the University of Alberta conference, which I also attended online, there was an attempt to prove the Greater Magadha hypothesis by using genetics. This also is not a new move, because at the bottom of that Buddhist Brahmanic distinction, there was always a notion of racial contamination, that Brahmanism begins at the moment when the Aryan element in India declines, and what you start seeing is the native aboriginal element with its obscene gods, its many-armed gods, etc., coming to the fore. So this is from Oldenburg's Literature of Ancient India. I will only read 2 lines of it because we have no time. Our consideration must now turn from Buddhism back to the poetic creations of the old faith. So the old faith being the Vedic faith, the Aryan faith. Naturally, this faith has not remained the same in the meantime. The Aryan gods with their human and humane forms, who were still inspired by a last breath of bracing northern air, have faded or disappeared. In their place, a new generation of gods has entered on stage. They are the Hindu gods, many-headed and many-armed, ranked with snakes, resting on lotuses, enveloped by an atmosphere of mysticism, lasciviousness, and cruelty. Mahabharata, of course, is the summary of this period, just as Rig Veda was the noblest work of Indian Aryanhood. Don't worry if you haven't been able to grasp the whole quote. I will put up a list of readings or a handout with the quotes on academia. The Mahabharata, this is repeated in his book on the Mahabharata, is the powerful connecting link between old and new India, between the India of the Aryan and the India of the Hindu. And then he repeats his comments about Hindu gods in another text and says, this is a transformation that affects the innermost core of the people's soul. Mixing with the dark-skinned aboriginals changes the invaders, turns the Aryans into Hindus. So you see how in the background of that thesis, there was always a racial component. Let us skip the purification of the epic. This is Richard Garber saying similar things about the rise of the aboriginal element. I will skip this also and come to a conclusion. Higher criticism freely sought contradictions. You remember he said Western scholars are objective. They found the objective breaks in the text. Indian scholars were not able to do this. No proof was required. Indeed, there was no method and no skill involved. Indologist arguments were based on explicitly racial or racist, anti-Semitic, and Christian evangelical agendas. Their aim was to displace the indigenous tradition and concentrate authority over texts in their hands. Let's return to the story we began with. Don Lopez, who portrayed the debate with the Dalai Lama as one between a scientific, objective, and historical approach and the Dalai Lama's traditional metaphysical views. The Ney Science, however, destroyed Indology's claims of scientificity. It showed that Indologists were biased rather than objective. The idea of historical reality is absolutely, unconditionally real is itself a metaphysical prejudice. Historicism arose from debates internal to Christian theology and biblical exegesis. Its attendant phenomenon, historical criticism, which is the method that von Stiekenkron calls philology, chiefly served to delegitimate Jewish scripture. And finally, the Indologists were not self-reflexive themselves. At this point, someone might say, this is just the old Orientalist critique, or rather the Saidian critique of Orientalism, and these accusations have been made about Vishwa and me that we are resentful, that we are diasporic Indians, we haven't been given the respect we feel is due to us. So let's answer these questions. Are these criticisms too general? Are they polemical? Not in the least. We provided a scholarly historical analysis and invited a scholarly engagement with our work. The responses ranged from ad hominems to accusing us of supporting Hindutva. So all of you know the Franco Review, you know other events that happened on various lists, where this was the cheapest and lowest accusation that can be made against an Indian scholar. Rather than engage in debate, Western Indologists activated the colonial disciplinary mechanism against us. In the question and answer session, I'd like to dwell on this a little and tell you how that works. Right now, I don't have the time. Some of the characterizations of our work and motivations have been plainly racist. On the next page, I actually have an example of a racist characterization. Because it's quite extensive, I won't read it, but it will be on the handout, which I will put up on academia. Let's now conclude. So I have 3 concluding slides. There are 2 types of enlightenment we might distinguish. The Buddhist, which is individual, implies extinction of the ego and means an awakening to what lies beyond the phenomenal perceptual world. So in the previous interview with the Dalai Lama that I read out to you, at one point, this person, the interviewer, asks him how much he meditates, and he says 5 hours. And the person is just shocked because to a Western conception, the idea of meditating that much a day, but that is the means. There is a kind of spiritual praxis and ascesis, which gives you access to higher levels of reality than the historical. And then this poor man who is so intensely meditative and practicing his Buddhism has to go to a university and be told by 3 Jejune graduate students, you're all wrong about these different bodies. There is only the historical reality, and we have the science of how your Buddhism developed. The European alternative is historical and communitarian. It asserts the ultimate authority of the modern subject. It radicalizes biblical anthropocentricity, and it rejects transcendent principles or explanatory schemes as metaphysical. Truth becomes historical, subjective, and ultimately relative. These are the ethical problems. If I'm not mistaken, this is my final slide. The next one is just an image. European enlightenment makes a totalizing claim. Either cultures are unenlightened or on their way to European enlightenment, understood as a historical epoch. So Buddhism would also say people are either unenlightened or on their way to enlightenment, but as individuals, not as people participating in a kind of story of a nation or in the story of world history. Further, it displaces ethics from knowledge. So this is the most striking feature of modernity, that ethical preparation is not linked to knowledge, whereas beginning from the Platonic tradition or even before that, the pre-Socratic and Pythagorean traditions, your ability to cognize something is based on a level of ethical purity. Those 2 things are indissociable. The contemporary phenomenon of woke ideology, so I apologize, there's a typo there, of woke ideology does not address anthropocentricity and historical relativism. It does not fulfill the need for a transcendental, non-subjective ethics such as either the Mosaic law or dharma. Academic historical critique and unthinking woke ideology are part of a larger reformist narrative. Besides iconoclasm, the humanities need a new method and new ideas, which historicism cannot supply. So that's my conclusion. These are some of the books in which Vishwa and I have explored these ideas, and this presentation, highly condensed though it was, is based on a significant amount of research that is carried out in these books. So I will stop here.
Thank you so much.
And